The roar of the sea is cut by thunder. The wind tears the sails apart, and the ship sways as if the ocean itself were trying to swallow the man standing there bound, yet calm. He grips a rope, staring into the horizon, and even with rain pouring down his face, there's an unshakable peace in his eyes. "Take heart, for I believe in God," he says, and his voice cuts through the storm like a beam of faith in the midst of chaos. This is Paul of Tarsus, the prisoner who taught the world that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to keep believing when everything seems lost. This is the story of a man who turned chains into wings and prisons into pulpits. A man who discovered that faith doesn't keep us from the storm, it teaches us how to walk on the waves. Today, you'll uncover the 15 lessons Paul left us to face life's battles with faith and courage, lessons powerful enough to reignite purpose even in the most weary heart. If you believe your story isn't over yet, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notifications, and come with me, because what's about to begin may transform the way you face your own battles. The sun burned over the desert, and dust swirled in golden spirals as horses thundered down the road to Damascus. Saul led the troop with the fierce look of a man convinced he was right. The hot air shimmered, as if the earth itself sensed what was coming, and then a flash. A light tore through the horizon like a divine blade, and the man fell to the ground, blind, vulnerable, silent. The sound of heavy breathing, the pounding heart, the dust clinging to his skin, the moment when pride collides with truth. The voice that echoes doesn't come from the outside, but from within. "Saul, why do you persecute me?" In that instant, time stopped. The man who thought he knew God was suddenly confronted by him. It was the end of an old name and the beginning of a new story. The first lesson we learn from Paul is that no past is too great for grace. Saul was an oppressor who became a messenger of freedom. God doesn't choose the perfect. He perfects those he chooses. What once was shame becomes the bridge to reach others. The past isn't the conclusion. It's the material God uses to build new beginnings. The second lesson we learn from Paul is that a fall can be the beginning of true vision. The light blinded him, yet it was in the darkness that he began to see his purpose. Sometimes God turns off every human light so the heart can notice the only one that matters. When life knocks us down, it's not punishment, it's repositioning. The ground, after all, can also be a starting point. The ground becomes an altar, the dust, a witness to rebirth. And between pain and silence, a calling is born. The voice does not condemn, it directs. Rise. What power lies in that word? It isn't an invitation to lift the body, but to awaken the soul. God didn't erase Saul's past, he turned it into fuel. Every mistake becomes a road leading toward purpose. The next scene unfolds in humility. The former persecutor is now led by the hand-blind, dependent, broken. The man who once dragged others to prison must now be guided like a child. And in that contrast lies the miracle. Before being used, one must be molded. Before speaking with authority, one must first learn to listen. In Damascus, silence becomes the teacher. Paul, isolated, faces his own soul. The external desert mirrors the internal one, and it's in that emptiness that God whispers. Sight doesn't return suddenly. It dawns like the sunrise, slow, luminous, inevitable. It's the time between the impact and the understanding, the interval where faith learns how to breathe. The murmurs of the streets return. People whisper, "Isn't he the persecutor?" Suspicion fills the air. Paul doesn't defend himself, he simply lives differently. The light in his eyes speaks louder than any sermon. True repentance doesn't need a microphone. It resounds through every transformed gesture. On this new journey, Paul discovers that true strength doesn't lie in the fist, but in surrender. He understands that weakness is the soil where God's power blooms. The man who once inspired fear now inspires courage. And thus, the road to Damascus becomes a symbol of what happens when light meets clay and turns it into gold. The wind rises again, lifting the dust along the path. Paul walks with new steps, guided no longer by certainty, but by faith. The road stretches before him like a film about to continue. because every genuine transformation opens the door to the next act, and his was only just beginning. Dawn breaks over the hills near Damascus. The wind stirs the fine dust of the road, and a lone figure walks into the horizon. It is Paul, newly transformed, still carrying the echo of the divine voice in his soul. He sets out toward Arabia, not to flee, but to follow a call. No angel walks beside him, no disciple trails behind. It is a voluntary exile, a sacred retreat where a man meets the silence of God. The landscape is barren, the sound of the wind like an ancient prayer. Paul carries no scrolls, no sermons, only questions. How could someone who has seen the light now walk in shadows? Solitude is not punishment, it is pause. And in that pause, we find the third lesson we learn from Paul. God works in us before he works through us. During his time in Arabia, far from human applause and expectation, Paul's soul is refined. The man who once knew Scripture by memory now begins to see it with new eyes, no longer as law, but as life. What was once duty becomes desire. What was once commandment becomes calling. The inner desert is not a place of abandonment, but of revelation. The persecutor becomes the one pursued not by enemies, but by his own conscience. Gradually, pride gives way to obedience. In silence, Paul realizes that the voices of the world had once drowned out the voice of God, and now the Creator retrains him through stillness. The fourth lesson we learn from Paul is that solitude can be the laboratory of faith, where the soul is tested and conviction matures. The days stretch endlessly. Time feels suspended. Yet each hour in Arabia is an unseen stone placed in the foundation of a ministry that would shape centuries. Paul learns that purpose doesn't begin in public, it begins in private. What God plants in obscurity will one day bloom in the open, and those who rush the process sacrifice the depth of their roots. 3 years pass. The man who entered in silence now carries a fire that will never go out. He returns to Damascus, no longer the persecutor, but the messenger. The transformation is no longer inward only. It now overflows in words, courage, and faith. The desert fades into the distance, but the lesson remains. Before one can speak to men, one must first listen to God. Paul's Arabia was not merely geographical, it was spiritual. Everyone called to a greater purpose must face their own season of stillness when life slows and the soul is shaped. It is the moment when God silences the noise of opinions so we can hear the whisper of truth. Silence is not emptiness, it is the sound of heaven speaking softly. Paul returns changed. His voice carries weight, his faith has depth. He now understands that there is no true ministry without obscurity, no authority without surrender. Whoever passes through Arabia never preaches the same, never lives the same. The desert has prepared him for chains, storms, and trials, but most of all, for the freedom that blooms within. The wind that once felt cold now blows as a reminder. The waiting was not wasted time, it was deep root work. Paul walks toward Damascus with steady steps and calm eyes. The silence is behind him, but its wisdom walks beside him. And in the distance, faintly, the sound of chains begins to ring. The next chapter of faith is about to begin. The stone walls drip with moisture. The torch flickers, casting shadows that dance across the chains fastened to the ground. In the midst of the cold and darkness stands Paul, shackled, yet serene. Bars surround him, but his thoughts move freely. He writes. Each word is a seed cast into time, destined to bloom in hearts he will never meet. The echo of iron striking iron blends with a soft scratch of a quill on parchment. And there, in the most unlikely of pulpits, arises the fifth lesson we learn from Paul. Faith does not depend on circumstances. While many chase external freedom, he discovers that true liberation begins within. The body may be bound, but the spirit continues to move. The jailer watches, puzzled. How can a prisoner sing? Paul smiles, and his peace confounds fear itself. Every psalm sung behind bars becomes a silent shout of victory. The sixth lesson we learn from Paul is that courage is born from the certainty of purpose. When one knows why they suffer, pain ceases to be punishment and becomes a pathway. The letters written there amid the cold, the hunger, the loneliness would travel across empires and centuries. Philippians, Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, words forged in chains yet released in power. Paul understands that God's purpose isn't confined to comfort. It often flourishes on the damp floor of adversity. The nights are long and the silence deep. Yet between one sigh and the next, gratitude arises. From it comes the seventh lesson we learn from Paul. Gratitude is a powerful weapon against discouragement. Instead of complaining, he gives thanks. Instead of doubting, he trusts. A grateful mind is an open cell no one can imprison, a heart that chooses to see blessing amid pain. The chains, once symbols of shame, now become invisible crowns. Suffering, once an enemy, now an ally. Paul realizes that every earthly prison is merely an illustration of eternal freedom. He writes with conviction, "I can do all things through him who strengthens me." The phrase thunders through time, freeing generations of invisible prisoners. The guard's change shifts, but the testimony never changes. There is no anger in his words, no despair in his eyes, only peace. A peace that doesn't depend on circumstances, status, or comfort. Paul's secret wasn't to endure captivity, but to transcend it. True freedom isn't about escaping the cell. It's about refusing to be chained by fear. When dawn seeps through the crack in the wall, lighting his weary face, hope gleams in his eyes. He doesn't write for himself, but for all who will one day feel the weight of their own chains. For each of us, at some point, will be called to prove whether our faith can withstand the confinement of suffering. Paul doesn't leave prison defeated. He leaves greater. The man imprisoned by Rome became a free voice in the kingdom of God. The chains that sought to silence him turned into an echo of eternity. And as the morning light guides him toward his next challenge, one truth remains. Those who are free within can never be imprisoned without. The wind howls fiercely, and the sea rises like a living beast, ready to swallow the ship whole. Waves crash against the hull, and the shouts of sailors mingle with the roar of the storm. The sky darkens, the compass spins, and hope seems to have jumped overboard. Amid the chaos, a prisoner stands tall. Rain drenches his face, but his eyes reflect an unshakable calm. It is Paul chained, yet free within. The storm lashes harder, the ship rocks, the ropes snap, yet Paul's gaze remains fixed on the unseen. A sudden pause between the thunder is broken by his voice. "Take heart, for I believe in God." The words echo like a beacon through the tempest. And there, in the heart of despair, arises the eighth lesson we learned from Paul. God remains in control, even when the ship breaks apart. The sailors stare, bewildered. How can a man speak of courage when death hovers in every wave? But Paul continues, firm and steady, his voice cutting through the storm. He reminds them of what was revealed to him. "But now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood by me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you.'" Acts of the Apostles, chapter 27, verses 22 through 24. The storm doesn't stop, but something shifts inside them. Fear gives way to faith. The promise replaces the panic. Paul teaches them that faith doesn't mean closing your eyes to danger, it means opening your heart to certainty. And so comes the ninth lesson we learn from Paul. Faith is the anchor in chaos. The waves may still crash, but the soul stays afloat. The ship groans, timbers crack, and the sound of splitting wood echoes like destiny itself. The vessel shatters, but the promise stands firm. Each fragment floating in the sea becomes a reminder that God never said the ship would survive, only that the people would. And here unfolds the 10th lesson we learn from Paul. Every shipwreck can hide a miracle. The impact, is violent. The sea claims the vessel, and men are thrown into the dark water. Screams, prayers, and shattered dreams fill the night. Yet among the wreckage, hope floats men, clinging to broken planks, carried by the mercy of God. Not one life is lost. What seemed like the end becomes the exact fulfillment of the divine words spoken in the storm. Hours later, the cold gray shore of Malta appears through the mist. The sea returns to the land what it tried to devour. Paul is the first to rise, helping others out of the surf. The prisoner becomes a leader, the survivor a shepherd. He doesn't arrive triumphant. He arrives alive. Because when God makes a promise, survival itself becomes the miracle. As a fire is kindled to warm the shivering men, a viper leaps from the sticks and fastens on his hand. The people gasp, waiting for him to collapse. But Paul simply shakes the creature off into the flames. No pain, no harm. The crowd stares, stunned, realizing this man is not ordinary. The one who survived the storm now conquers the serpent. Not even venom can touch what grace protects. The morning sun rises over Malta, and the once raging sea now lies calm, mirroring the quiet strength of Paul's spirit. He gazes at the horizon, his face lit by the dawn. The ship is gone, but the promise remains. He understands at last, faith is not a lifeboat. It is the wind that still blows, even when every sail is torn. The man once carried by the waves now carries others toward the shore of belief. The chains rattle softly as Paul holds the parchment. The air in the prison is thick, it smells of iron and solitude. Outside, the Roman Empire celebrates its victories. Inside, a solitary man writes words that will outlive empires. His cell is dark, yet every line he pens shines like dawn across the centuries. There are no crowds to hear him, only walls, cold, and faith. He dips the quill into a crude inkpot and begins. Rejoice in the Lord always. The guard watches him, puzzled. What joy can be found in chains? Paul smiles. He knows that suffering is a language God translates into purpose. And there is born the 11th lesson we learn from Paul. The word of faith crosses walls. Iron can confine the body, but not the truth. Each letter is a seed cast into the soil of the future. Philippi, Ephesus, Colossae, Rome, different destinations, one same message, hope. And in the middle of one of these letters, while the world calls him a prisoner, he writes one of the most powerful phrases ever recorded. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. The epistle of the Apostle Paul to the Philippians, chapter 4, verse 13. The chains may shake, but his conviction does not. Here is born the 12th lesson we learn from Paul. True strength comes from dependence on God. The world teaches us to trust in titles, status, and power, but Paul learned to rely only on grace. He realized that faith is not an escape from pain, but a strength that carries us through it with dignity. The same God who allowed the prison gave him words that would set countless souls free. The cold stones do not silence him, they awaken him. Paul writes of joy, gratitude, and contentment, themes that seem impossible for a man in chains, and yet his words pulse with life. He understands that spiritual joy is not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. That is the 13th lesson we learn from Paul. As he writes, the quill scratches the parchment like a heartbeat, echoing hope. He doesn't complain, accuse, or pity himself. He speaks with the serenity of one who has seen the invisible. The secret of his peace isn't found in his circumstances, but in the unshakable trust that the God who called him will sustain him to the end. His letters leave the cell in the hands of faithful messengers, Epaphroditus, Timothy, Tychicus. They don't realize they are carrying the words that will outlast empires. What was born in confinement becomes the nourishment of nations. The cold floor of the cell is, in truth, the fertile soil of eternity. The guard watches him again. There's something unearthly about this man. Paul speaks of love. With such conviction, that fear loses its grip. His faith is contagious, and the silence of the prison turns into worship. Before their eyes, he proves that chains hold no power over those who are already free within. As he finishes another letter, he lifts his gaze and smiles. A ray of sunlight slips through the crack in the wall, illuminating the page. He knows his voice will echo far beyond the walls, for what is born of faith cannot fade with time. And as he folds the parchment, a quiet certainty fills the air. This prison was never the end. It was the altar where hope became eternal word. The cell is silent. The torch flickers faintly, and the chill of the Roman night seeps through the stone. Paul, now aged, watches the trembling flame as one who contemplates the close of a long journey. His body bears the marks of many battles, scars, lashes, exhaustion, yet his eyes still shine with the calm of a man who has already conquered within. He does not fear death. He understands it as homecoming. The quill moves slowly across the parchment. Each word feels like a farewell, yet it sounds like a beginning. He writes to Timothy, the young disciple who carries the message forward. And with the steady voice of one at peace with time itself, he declares, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day." The second epistle of the Apostle Paul to Timothy, chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. The sound of those words echoes like a hymn of both farewell and triumph. There is born the 14th lesson we learn from Paul. The life of faith is a race, and every step is worth it. He does not speak of earthly victories, but of perseverance, the quiet strength of one who kept going when others gave up. Every tear, every wound, every prison cell became a step toward eternity. The running is done, but eternity awaits at the finish line. Paul knows that the promised crown is not made of gold, but of a purpose fulfilled. He looks back without regret, only gratitude, for he sees that every trial was training, every wilderness a necessary mile toward the goal. As he writes, a faint smile softens his face. He speaks of death, yet radiates life, for he knows that the end, for those who believe, is only the beginning of greater glory. And in that awareness, he reveals the 15th lesson we learn from Paul. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is trusting, even while trembling. The chains that once wounded him now seem like ornaments of honor. What the world calls defeat, God calls testimony. Paul understands that the same hands that once bound him will soon guide him into eternal freedom. The old apostle does not dread the executioner he greets him, as one finally seeing the gate of home after a long road. Outside, keys rattle. The moment is near. Yet Paul is calm. His final breaths are not of despair, but surrender. He thinks of the churches, of the brothers and sisters, of those who heard him preach, and even of those who persecuted him. Each one, in their own way, was part of the story that led him here. The torch dies out. The cell sinks into silence. The weary body rests. The spirit is free at last. The faith that began on the road to Damascus now crosses into eternity. Life ends, but legacy begins. In the years to come, his words continue to travel across the world. Those letters, born of pain and hope, become a voice that time cannot silence. Paul is gone, but his faith remains aflame, burning in every heart that chooses to endure. And the echo of his life seems to whisper through the centuries. The prize is not for those who finish first, it's for those who never give up. The sea is calm once more. The waves brush gently against the rocks, as if the Mediterranean itself were whispering the story of the man who once defied it with faith. The ship is gone, the chains have rusted, and Paul's body rests in the earth. But his voice still echoes through the centuries. Every word he wrote became a beacon for those still sailing through storms. In homes, in churches, in wounded hearts, his letters remain alive. They were not written for a single era, but for every soul that has ever felt the silence of God. And through the folds of time, his message continues to resound. Faith does not avoid the struggle, it transforms it. What was once a prison became an altar. What was once a wound became a testimony. The flame that burned within him never went out, for Paul did not live for himself. He lived for a cause greater than his own name, stronger than the empire that tried to silence him. But I do not account my life of any value nor as precious to myself, if only I may finish my course with joy and the ministry that I received from the Lord Jesus, to testify to the gospel of the grace of God. The Acts of the Apostles, chapter 20, verse 24. His words, spoken in a time of swords and fire, still carry the same power today. They speak to the one who suffers, who doubts, who is weary. They remind us that there is no prison stronger than fear, and no freedom greater than faith. That courage is not measured by steady steps, but by the direction we keep walking when the ground shakes beneath us. Paul's legacy is not a statue or a monument. It is a flame burning in every life that chooses to believe. He taught us that endings in God's hands are merely beginnings in disguise. That true faith never dies, it multiplies. That those who sow in tears will one day reap in eternity. And so, as the sun sinks beyond the horizon, an unseen voice seems to ride upon the wind of time. It is the same voice that once encouraged sailors, strengthened prisoners, and lifted the fallen. Even now, it calls us to keep running, keep believing, keep loving, because, in the end, only one thing matters, that the race ends with faith, and the soul with gratitude. The waves grow calm, and Paul's voice still seems to echo between the sound of the wind and the beating of the heart. He reminded us that faith isn't an escape, it's strength. That courage isn't the absence of fear, it's a choice, and that even in life's prisons, it's possible to remain free within. Each of his 15 lessons is a burning lighthouse, guiding those who still face storms. Now the question is, what will you do with this light? If this message spoke to your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications. There's much more to uncover about how faith can transform your story. And before you go, watch the video appearing on your screen. It's the next step on this journey of courage, purpose, and transformation, because Paul's story may have ended, but yours is only beginning.